The biting salt wind of the North Pacific was the last truly natural thing Ethan Vance felt. At 16 he was more sinew than bulk, honed by years spent obsessively testing his limits against the wilderness surrounding the remote Alaskan research outpost where his parents worked. He crouched by the literal edge, his camouflage jacket blending perfectly with the damp, slate rock, tracking the migration patterns of seabirds for a biome study. His world was small, challenging, and entirely predictable, until the sky ripped open. It wasn't the sound that announced their arrival, but the cessation of all other sound. The air pressure dropped, leaving his ears popping painfully, and a shadow, immense and geometrically impossible, swallowed the afternoon light. 3 sleek, obsidian dropships, silent as void, phased into existence barely 100 meters from the coast. Ethan didn't need a military briefing to understand the malice radiating from their alien presence. His survival instincts, honed on bears and blizzards, screamed apex predator. The ships disgorged the Klar Imperium. They were things of segmented, midnight blue chitin, standing nearly 2.5 meters tall on 4 rigid legs, their upper torsos housing twin, glowing crimson eyes and massive, jointed claws. They moved with a chilling, hierarchical efficiency. Their armor was dull, heavy, and impervious to the panicked, scattershot rifle fire from the outpost's meager security detail. The Klar weren't conducting an invasion, they were conducting a harvest. Ethan didn't freeze. He reacted. Shucking his jacket and backpack, he bolted inland, not towards the futile defense of the facility, but towards the dense, unmonitored spruce forest, the only place he stood a chance. He witnessed a Klar trooper effortlessly vaporize one of the researchers with a plasma discharge, the sheer, casual finality of the act searing itself into his mind. Fear was present, a cold stone in his gut, but it was quickly being overlaid by a burning, incandescent fury. They had taken his world and they didn't even see him as a challenge. His evasion was short-lived. A low-flying sensor drone, no bigger than a large hawk, detected his anomalous movement. Before he could find cover, a wide-beam stun blast slammed into his back. The pain was immediate and paralyzing but fleeting. As his muscles locked, his last conscious act was to clench his teeth around a small, sharp piece of polished obsidian he always carried, a habit from his survival training. He was dragged, unconscious, back toward the dropship. He awoke mid-transit, strapped into a high-density restraint cradle on the deck of the Klar transport ship, the Harvester's Gleam. The environment was alien, a low-humidity, high-gravity atmosphere that felt like a stifling blanket to Ethan, but was clearly optimized for the massive, clicking movements of the guards. A handful of other human captives, along with a few terrified-looking, vaguely reptilian aliens, were similarly restrained. The Klar, preoccupied with cataloging their valuable organic cargo, seemed to view the holding bay as entirely secure. The central conflict was immediately evident. The Klar were creatures of rigid protocol and technology-based confidence. Their security was based on overwhelming force and the assumption that their prey was mentally inferior. They failed to account for the unique brand of focused, adaptive terror a human subject could possess. Ethan began his observation. He memorized the rhythmic click of the floor plating beneath the guard's massive feet, the exact cadence of the automated life support system, and, most crucially, the single, momentary power fluctuation that occurred every 28.3 minutes when the ship's massive warp drive cycled a diagnostic check. During one such fluctuation, the force field around his cradle sputtered. It lasted less than half a second, but it was enough. Using the obsidian sliver he'd held onto, Ethan had worked on the restraint's locking mechanism during the intervening cycles, weakening the polymer housing. When the next fluctuation hit, he wrenched his arm free, ignoring the torn skin and shrieking pain. The escape was a masterpiece of desperate silence. The moment his feet touched the deck, the high gravity, which should have crushed him, became an asset. It slowed the reaction time of the approaching Klar guard, who was accustomed to moving in a predictable, measured gait. Ethan moved low and fast. He used the guard's own heavy, segmented knee joint as a fulcrum, leveraging his entire body weight into a focused, brutal strike. The Klar emitted a high-pitched, surprised shriek as its legs snapped outward, its heavy armor now trapping it. Ethan grabbed the guard's helmet, smashing its heavy ocular sensor array against the steel grating before it could sound an alarm. He quickly appropriated a small data pad clipped to the creature's belt, recognizing the complex, glowing glyphs as some form of navigation and data storage. A swift glance at the display confirmed his terrible destination, Klar Prime. They weren't just taking him to a prison, they were taking him to the heart of their empire. Escape was impossible, retaliation was mandatory. Clutching the stolen datapad and a small energy cutter he ripped from the wall panel, Ethan vanished into the ship's dense, unmonitored ventilation system, leaving the crippled Klar soldier behind as a silent promise. He wasn't cargo anymore. He was a contaminant. Deep within the humid, throbbing vessel, the harvester's gleam, Ethan became a ghost, traversing the narrow, choked service conduits meant only for drone maintenance. The stifling warmth was a constant, exhausting pressure, but it also masked the faint human scent that would have otherwise betrayed him. Weeks blurred into a harrowing, solitary existence sustained by stale emergency nutrient paste he found in a discarded Klar engineering kit and filtered condensation dripping from the pipes. His sole companion was the stolen datapad. Its surface glowed with complex, spiky Klar script, which Ethan voraciously consumed, using the onboard translator function he had painstakingly unlocked. He learned the language, Klari, a series of clicks and hisses, but more importantly he assimilated the mindset of the Imperium. Their society was a brutally efficient hierarchy built on unwavering, arrogant adherence to protocol. They viewed non-Kalar life not just as inferior, but as predictable. Their security systems, while technologically daunting, were utterly reliant on specific large-scale threats and failed to account for individual low-signature ingenuity. Their greatest weakness was their contempt for anything small or unsanctioned, the vermin of the vents. The datapad also confirmed his destination, Klar Prime, the central nexus of the Imperium. A teeming high-gravity megalopolis spanning a continent, it was a world of towering, segmented structures and perpetually dim, filtered light. This was not a fortress to be escaped from, it was a heart to be stopped. His initial desperate desire for mere survival morphed into a cold, calculated ambition. If he left, they would simply return for more. He had to excise the threat at its origin. When the Harvester's Gleam finally docked in the colossal orbital tethering port of Klar Prime, Ethan was nestled deep within a container of discarded biological waste meant for incineration. The transfer was loud, chaotic, and conducted entirely by massive autonomous loaders, a perfect cover. He emerged into the planet's atmosphere, a suffocating mix of methane and heavy particulates, the weight of the gravity immediate and crushing. It felt like running through concrete, forcing him to keep low, relying on the four walls of the narrow service shaft he had entered. He spent the subsequent days navigating the infrastructure beneath the towering Klar cityscape. This subterranean realm was a circulatory system of humming power lines, sewage sluices and abandoned maintenance pathways, the places the proud, clean Klar never ventured. Here, his instincts, honed in the Alaskan wilderness, were his only defense. He became adept at identifying edible fungi, tapping into purified water lines, and crafting temporary shelters from salvaged insulation and scrap metal. He was no longer Ethan Vance, the student. He was a resourceful anomaly, a parasitic intelligence feeding on the waste of a decadent empire. Through constant observation, Ethan focused on two critical installations: the Planetary Defense Nexus (PDN), the primary control for the orbital fleet, and the Central Energy Reactor (CR), the fusion power source that ran everything. Targeting these two nodes, he reasoned, would not just halt the Klar but paralyze them. His stealth was absolute, his presence undetectable. He noticed, however, small, subtle disturbances in the deeper tunnels. He began encountering signs of other sentient life. Tiny, crude carvings in an unfamiliar language, carefully placed markers warning of specific drone patrol routes, and once, a small cache of medical supplies clearly meant for a non-Kalar physiology. These were the traces of the oppressed races, the beings forced into the low-caste, servile roles of maintenance and labor that the Klar deemed beneath them. Ethan did not seek them out. Alliance was a risk he could not afford. Yet, their presence confirmed a fundamental weakness in the Imperium. The society was built not on loyalty but on fear and suppressed resentment. He spent a full week observing the PDN's sub-level air filtration unit. It was protected by thick, laser-cut steel, but the Klar technicians, confident in their advanced metallurgy, had used a cheap, composite sealant in the seams to save time. Using the stolen energy cutter, adapted with scrap metal to focus its beam, Ethan began the agonizingly slow process of scoring the perimeter. He knew a direct breach was suicide. He needed a way to introduce himself to the system, not crash through it. Finally, after hours of strained effort, he managed to shear away a small 3-centimeter square plate. Peering through the gap, he saw not guards but junction boxes and data lines. With a triumphant, silent surge of adrenaline, Ethan pulled a small, custom-made device from his belt. A makeshift, high-density flash drive he had wired together from the Klar datapad's internal components. This device carried a simple but devastating code, a system lockout protocol designed to scramble access credentials. If he could upload it, the entire planetary defense system would become a million-ton brick. He took one last, deep, labored breath of the heavy, chemical air. He was no longer hiding. He was preparing to initiate the hunt. The apex predator had reached the jungle floor. The quiet insertion of the homemade flash drive into the PDN sublevel data port was the softest sound that ushered in Clar Prime's long night. Ethan secured the small breach, the composite sealant he had stolen curing rapidly with a portable heat coil, leaving the ventilation shaft looking undisturbed. The upload was instantaneous, a tiny, toxic packet of code worming its way into the massive, redundant systems. It didn't crash the planetary defense nexus. It poisoned it, subtly corrupting the encryption keys and scrambling the biometric clearances. The Clar didn't notice the systemic infection. They simply saw that General Carwell's access card was mysteriously failing in Sector Beta, a minor inconvenience attributed to routine electronic wear. This was Phase 1, disruption. Ethan retreated deeper into the city's underbelly, moving through the vast, humming network of the industrial waste treatment district. He now operated with a chilling economy of movement, his body fully adapted to the high gravity. His metabolism had adjusted, his musculature tightening into lean, durable cords, and the permanent layer of grime on his clothes served as perfect camouflage against the shadowed pipes and vents. He had fully embraced the role of the shadow hunter, a creature far more dangerous than the armed military they expected. The Clar reacted predictably to the initial technical glitches. Their response was massive, slow, and overly reliant on protocol. They mobilized heavily armored squads, the Chiton legions, in massive lumbering formations, searching the obvious targets, the primary control centers and orbital communications towers. They failed to look beneath their feet. Ethan used their predictability against them, leveraging his knowledge of their caste psychology. He knew they feared the oppressed laboring species more than a theoretical human escapee, so he used the captured Clar datapad to transmit brief, coded messages suggesting organized resistance among the subservient non-Kalar workers. The first major strike was surgical and psychological. Ethan targeted the largest military barracks, a sprawling, imposing structure in the industrial zone. He didn't attack the facility itself. Instead, he slipped into the substation powering the barracks' specialized atmospheric conditioning unit, the equipment necessary to regulate the humidity and temperature that the massive Clar bodies required to function optimally. Using a small, shaped charge of scavenged reactive fuel, he breached the coolant pipes, releasing a corrosive vapor that wasn't deadly, but was immensely irritating to their delicate respiratory systems. Panic ensued. The Chiton legions, struggling against a sudden, localized spike in humidity and chemical irritants, abandoned formation. They blamed a maintenance malfunction, a predictable oversight from the serval castes. In the resulting chaos, Ethan struck his only direct blow. He disabled a communications relay hub with an electromagnetic pulse device he had carefully crafted from the CR's discarded power cells. The Clar lost external contact for 3 agonizing hours. Their official explanation was act of industrial sabotage. Their internal designation, however, was far more telling: the unseen contaminant. Ethan meanwhile secured better tools. He ambushed a lone Clar scout patrol, 3 soldiers foolishly navigating a narrow maintenance junction that offered no flank defense. The engagement was swift, brutal, and silent. Relying on surprise and the environmental constraints of the tunnel, Ethan disabled them not with their own weapons, but with the tunnel itself, collapsing a section of unstable piping that pinned 2 of the soldiers while he dispatched the third using the momentum of his high-gravity frame. He stripped the functional gear: a lightweight energy pistol, a multi-frequency communication device, and most crucially, a set of kinetic dispersion gauntlets that would help him move faster under the crushing gravity. Now armed and equipped with superior mobility, the warfare escalated. Ethan shifted from pure disruption to active erosion. He began targeting logistics, disabling the massive filtration plants that supplied the central district with water, contaminating food synthesis depots, and rerouting sewage lines back into the lower caste housing areas, a move he knew would further inflame internal tensions. He was systematically dismantling the Clar's sense of security, showing them that their advanced technology and overwhelming numbers were useless against an enemy who lived within their walls. The Clar, realizing the scale of the threat, finally sent a specialized hunt team, smaller, faster, and equipped with heat-seeking sensors. They set a trap in an abandoned docking bay, using a group of captured, terrified reptilian aliens as bait, hoping to lure the contaminant into the open. Ethan saw the bait, but he also saw the flaw. the hunters were focused entirely on the line of sight leading to the captives. He did not take the bait. Instead, he used the diversion to execute Phase 2. He triggered a small, highly localized tectonic stabilizer beneath the docking bay, causing a massive, violent vibration that shattered the bay's ceiling support. The hunters, caught in the falling debris and dust, were neutralized not by gunfire, but by structural failure. As he watched the subsequent frantic Klar salvage operation from his perch high on a power tower, a cold, focused satisfaction settled over him. He hadn't fired a single unnecessary shot, yet he had crippled a full tactical unit. The Klar were not fighting a warrior, they were fighting the planet itself, manipulated by a single desperate mind. The time for subtle contamination was over. With his new equipment and the widespread panic he had engineered, Ethan turned his gaze toward the primary target, the massive humming edifice of the central energy reactor. It was time for the final push. The final approach to the central energy reactor (CR) was a masterclass in exploiting overconfidence. The Klar, convinced that any large-scale threat would come from the sky or the main access routes, had neglected the deep maintenance arteries feeding the complex. Ethan, now fully utilizing the mobility afforded by the scavenged kinetic dispersion gauntlets, moved with an almost unnatural swiftness through the high-gravity labyrinth, the metallic clicks of his boots barely audible over the immense basso hum of the fusion core. His goal was precise: trigger a controlled containment overload. Not an explosion that would wipe out the planet, that was counterproductive, but a systemic failure that would force a total, months-long shutdown, crippling the Imperium's industrial and military capacity worldwide. He needed access to the primary coolant manifold and the emergency override console, both nestled deep within the reactor's shielded heart. The internal security of the CR was built on layers of automated drone patrols and reinforced blast doors. Using the energy pistol he had acquired, modified to fire low-power, targeted pulses, Ethan disabled the sentry drones one by one, exploiting the predictable gaps in their patrol patterns. He was a silent, lethal variable inserted into a deterministic equation. The thick, superheated atmosphere around the core was punishing, searing his lungs with every breath, yet his human tenacity, fueled by months of deprivation and rage, pushed him past the physical breaking point. He finally reached the heavily fortified command level. The corridor was narrow and flanked by plasma projectors, a textbook Klar choke point. However, their reliance on biometric locks meant that once the lock was breached, the rest of the internal security assumed compliance. Ethan used a highly corrosive alien acid he had synthesized from the contents of the CER's waste reservoirs to etch through the sensor panel, not enough to trip the alarm, but enough to burn out the mechanism. He then slipped through the door moments before the emergency lock protocol activated. Inside, the reactor control room was surprisingly sparse, a cathedral to cold, efficient technology. And waiting by the main console was General Vex, the sector overseer, a Klar officer of immense size, his obsidian armor thicker and darker than any Ethan had encountered. Vex was not panicked. He was enraged and utterly contemptuous. The vermin finally reveals itself, the general's voice rasped through a heavy vocoder, the Klari clicks echoing in the silent chamber. One low-gravity primate caused all this disruption. Pathetic. Ethan didn't reply. Words were pointless. This was the final, defining confrontation. Man versus monolithic arrogance. The general relied on brute force and armor, charging forward like a heavily mechanized siege engine. Ethan, knowing he couldn't withstand a direct blow, utilized every aspect of his superior human physiology. He was faster, more agile, and crucially, unpredictable. He used the kinetic gauntlets not for striking, but for propulsion, bounding off the walls and ceiling, making the general's targeting systems useless in the confined space. Vex's slow, sweeping blows missed wildly, his heavy plating making him sluggish in the high gravity. Ethan focused his attack on the exposed joints where the thick chitin met the general's neck casing, small areas of vulnerability the Klar assumed were protected by their size. He lashed out with the energy cutter, now set to a continuous high-frequency vibration, scoring the sensitive joint. The general roared, momentarily incapacitated. Ethan seized the opening, delivering a desperate full-force kick to the general's center of mass, a move that would have shattered a human's leg, but only served to momentarily unbalance the alien behemoth. As Vex stumbled, Ethan activated the magnetic clamps on the gauntlets, momentarily securing himself to the metallic console beside the general's head. This gave him the leverage needed to deliver a final, devastating, concussive blow with the hilt of the cutter to the primary sensor block on the general's helmet. The general collapsed, unconscious, his body sparking with short-circuited energy. Victorious but utterly spent, Ethan dragged the general's massive form to the console. He needed the biometric retinal scan. With trembling hands, he activated the emergency override and began inputting the data he had deciphered from the datapad. He flooded the coolant lines with the synthesized corrosive compound and initiated the sequence. The control room sirens shrieked to life, glowing ruby red. The console flashed a massive warning: containment breach imminent, global shutdown required. Ethan had achieved the maximum systemic failure without planetary destruction. Klar Prime would go dark in less than an hour, demanding an immediate total system reboot lasting months. But before the final safety protocols locked him out, Ethan found the planet's short-range messaging system. He had one final, crucial action to complete. He quickly composed a message in crisp, formal Klari, setting it for a high-frequency broadcast that would reach the orbital fleet and all major garrisons. He locked the message for time transmission and then ran. He abandoned the control room, leaving the unconscious General Vex as the only witness to the devastation he had wrought. He had broken the heart of the Imperium. Now he needed to escape the dying planet before the fleets realized their home was defeated. The finality of the reactor alarms was a deafening symphony of impending collapse, yet the sound gave Ethan a grim sort of energy. His mind, utterly purged of fear, focused entirely on extraction. He raced through the labyrinthine sublevels of the central energy reactor, his body protesting every jarring movement, his lungs burning with the chemical air. He had to reach the deepest shuttle bay, a classified area known only to high-level officers and marked on the general's datapad as the Scout Contingency. He burst into the circular bay, a vast, echoing cavern that housed a single, sleek vessel, a prototype scout fighter built for deep space reconnaissance. Sirens flashed red across the bay's ceiling, and he could hear the heavy, metallic clanking of the responding chitin legions sealing off the upper levels. There was no time for finesse. This was pure flight. Ethan vaulted into the pilot's seat. The controls were dense and alien, but his intensive study of the Klar technical manuals paid dividends. His hands moved instinctively, bypassing biometric failsafes with coded sequences he'd memorized from surveillance logs. The Klar valued complexity over intuition. Ethan valued speed over safety. He wrestled the ship's controls, forcing the heavy gravity retraction claws to release the vessel. As the shuttle bay doors hissed open, revealing the smoke-choked sky of Klar Prime, the timed message he had set at the CR console finally broadcast. Across the planet and outward toward the orbital fleet, a clear, authoritative signal cut through the rising static and alarm chatter. The message was stark: Klar Prime is compromised. Containment failure protocol initiated. Planetary resources seized. Your vessels are required for immediate defense of Imperial holdings beyond the system. Do not return. The cargo has delivered the price. The Earth is protected. You have lost your planet. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The returning invasion fleet, still in near orbit, suddenly had its home world go dark beneath its massive hulls, compounded by the crippling scramble in the PDN's navigation and communication systems. The fleet fractured. An hour of targeted psychological and infrastructural sabotage had accomplished what decades of full-scale war could not. The Klar leadership, stripped of communication and witnessing the core of their power wink out, turned immediately on itself, the rigid caste system collapsing into bitter, terrified warlordism. Ethan pushed the scout ship hard through the dense atmosphere. Looking back, he watched the massive, segmented cityscape descend into a patchwork of utter darkness. The containment field on the CR had fully overloaded, initiating the total power grid collapse. The silence that followed the loss of the massive fusion core's hum was more terrifying than the alarms. It was the sound of a civilization suffocating on its own arrogance. He punched the hyperdrive sequence and watched the stars warp. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt only an immense, aching vacuum. The boy who was stolen was gone, replaced by something harder, something forged in weeks of subterranean desperation and the cold calculus of calculated violence. He had avenged his world, but he carried the ghost of the planet he had broken. Months later, the small, anonymous Klar scout ship drifted into Earth's distant lunar space. Its lone passenger initiated a discreet distress signal, and a startled, high-level task force met him in a secure, classified hangar. Ethan stepped out of the alien craft, gaunt, scarred, and wearing the simple drab clothes he'd cobbled together from scavenged insulation. He was 17, yet his eyes held the weary, ruthless focus of a veteran strategist. He delivered the captured technology, the encrypted Klar data, and the full, horrifying narrative of his campaign not as a survivor seeking comfort, but as an analyst detailing a threat. When the Earth commander, visibly shaken, stammered a word of congratulations, Ethan simply shook his head. "They won't forget," he said, his voice flat, his Clary accent momentarily blending into his native English. "They are shattered, but they are still predators. They only learned one lesson: do not come here for easy prey." He refused celebrity, medals, or therapy. The boy who had been a creature of raw, adaptable survival now understood the true nature of the apex predator. It doesn't just survive, it shapes the environment to its will and stands eternal guard. His actions had bought humanity time, and he intended to ensure that time was not wasted. He quietly accepted an advisory role in the newly formed Terra Defense Initiative, his unique, ruthless insight becoming the most formidable shield Earth possessed. Ethan stood alone in the sterile observation deck of the new initiative headquarters, staring out at the silent, deep void of space. He was the ghost that haunted the Klar Imperium, the single anomaly that proved humanity was not merely cargo but a primal force. He had traded his innocence for the planet, and as he watched the stars, the faint memory of the cold Alaskan wind a distant ache, he knew his watch had just begun. The universe was vast and there would be other predators, but they would all have to reckon with the lesson etched into the silent ruins of Klar Prime.